So in this tutorial we'll be learning how to create this inflating text effect, and some of the main techniques we'll be covering include having better control over a cloth simulation by animating the stiffness of certain areas, using shape keys to reverse a cloth simulation, and then we'll also be looking at using multiple hook constraints on a single object. So the first thing I'd like to do is explain what the focus of this tutorial is going to be, because obviously the final effect is quite a complex one. So obviously I've already got my text here, so I'm not actually going to be showing the building of the text, but I will go over the topology of the mesh a bit later on. I'm also not going to be covering how to create, rig, or render the pump, which was providing the air to our inflating text, but I am going to show how to connect and disconnect the cable that went between the pump and the text. Now, I did mention that this was a mesh, and you'll notice it has nice even topology, and that's because I made this by hand. And I'm sure a lot of you are saying, well, you could have just, made a text object and converted it to a mesh, and yes, you could have done that, but the topology that you'll get from that, and even if you spend time fixing it up, will not be good enough for what we're going to do. We're going to be using a cloth simulation, and it helps to have nice even faces, and you'll notice these are all quads and not triangles, which is what you would get if you converted the text. You'll also notice that I have put in extra loops, so even though this wasn't necessary to build the text, it does make these big faces slightly smaller. And we want nice even faces so that we get a nice even collapsing look when we do the cloth. And the reason why I'm not showing this is because I've actually covered how to build this text quite a few times in my previous tutorials, so if you're not sure of how to build this text, have a look at some of them. I've also built a little valve here, and that was just a simple extrusion out, and that's where the cable is going to connect. And so the first thing we're going to do is join these two letters, and obviously if you've got more letters you're going to be doing this for each one. I'm going to select a few faces where I'm imagining a tube is going to connect these, and I'm going to press E. I'm going to scale it in, and then I'm going to delete those faces, and I'm then going to select these edges with Alt and a click, and I'm going to use an add-on called Loop Tools. So if you want to enable this add-on, you can go to File, User Preferences, Add-ons, and search for the Loop Tools. And so when I press W to bring up the Specials menu, we've got Loop Tools at the top, and I'm going to choose Circle. And what it's done is taken those edges and just changed it into a circle shape. So obviously we want that for the tube. And then I'm going to repeat that for the faces over here where they're going to connect. So I'm going to extrude, scale it in, delete the faces, select the edges, W, I'm going to Alt select these, Alt Shift select these, and then I'm going to press W and then bridge to edge loops, and you can see it's joined them together. And then I'm going to press F6 to bring up the pop-up with the options, and I'm going to increase the number of cuts to 2, and you can see we've now got a nice tube connecting our text. So another thing you'll also notice is I've got some edge loops in here. So these edge loops are just put in by controller, and this will just sharpen up the edges a bit. You'll see they're not right at the edge, so we are going to get slight curvature once we add a subsurf, and that's what we're going to do now. So over to the modifiers, add a subsurf, and then I'm going to press T, smooth shading, and we can turn up the divisions to 2, and you can see we've got quite nice text, and those edge loops aren't right by the edge, so it's not completely sharp. Now I mentioned that we're going to be using cloth, and the method that we're actually going to use is by creating this animation, at least to begin with, backwards. So we're going to use our cloth simulation to collapse this text, and then later on we're going to reverse that effect so it looks like the text is inflating. So I'm going to go to the physics panel and add cloth, and I'm actually going to turn our subsurf down to 1 because we don't want too many faces for the cloth. And back over to the physics. The only thing I'm going to change for the minute is making sure we've got cloth collision on. I'm going to turn on self collision so it will collide with itself when it collapses. And so what I'm going to do, we need something for this cloth to be able to fall onto. I'm going to go into top view, Shift A, add mesh plane, and I'm going to scale it up. Make sure it's slightly below the mesh so the mesh can fall down onto it. And I'm going to enable collision on this plane so it will collide with it. And so then now we can test it. So I'm going to just press Alt A and we can see what's going on. So you can see this blue bar represents that it has baked some of the cloth animation, so we can now scroll through it without having to calculate. And you can see we're not getting a bad result. You know, it's colliding, it's falling down into a pile. But one thing that I thought should happen is that you've got to remember we're doing this backwards. So if we play this backwards, or if I just drag the timeline, it doesn't really look like it's inflating because the top is completely solid because it hasn't collapsed yet, but the bottom is completely flat. And if you imagine that when something is being filled with air, it actually fills up pretty evenly. So it doesn't make sense for this to be flat and this to be completely full. This shouldn't have held its shape so much. So what we need to do is stop the bottom from collapsing so quickly. So we're going to go back to the cloth settings, but something that we want is cloth stiffness scaling. So I'm going to enable it, and this basically brings up two vertex groups, and it allows us to use a vertex group to define where the mesh is stiff, so where it won't collapse, and where the mesh is not stiff, where it will collapse. And that's what we want to use. So where are we going to get this vertex group from? Well, we're going to use Dynamic Paint, and we're going to get it to generate a vertex group to control the stiffness. So to do that, I'm going to go into top view, Shift A, add a mesh cube, and I'm going to change its visibility in the object panel. Under display, I'm going to change it to wire, just so we can see through it, because we don't actually need to see the box itself, just its outline. So making sure it's covering all of the text. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the animation so we can see where it is. And then I'm going to position this roughly in the lower third of the text. So I'm going to go over to the physics because that's where Dynamic Paint is. I'm going to enable it. This is going to be our brush. So we're going to add the brush. And we're going to use mesh volume and proximity, which basically means it will paint everything inside the box and then it'll have a bit of a fall off. So as it gets further away, there'll be a slightly lower weight. And we'll see that a bit later on. So then we need to make sure our text also has Dynamic Paint. So I'm just going to collapse the cloth settings for a minute. This is going to be our canvas, so we're going to add it. We can already see some effect, but we don't actually want this because it's currently painting, and we want it to be giving a weight. And under our output, we can see we've got a vertex group that's being created, but it isn't there yet, so it's red. So we're just going to add it in. And we've got DP weight, well, Dynamic Paint weight. So now, if we go back to the cloth settings and the cloth stiffness scaling, we've now got a vertex group that we can put in here. So we can use DP weight. But a problem with the way we set it up is the order in which we did things. So we set up the cloth first and then the Dynamic Paint. And that affects the order that our modifiers were added in. And if you didn't know, the modifiers work in the order that they were added. So the first thing that will happen is that the subsurface is added to the mesh, then the cloth, and then the Dynamic Paint. But if you think about what we're doing, we're creating a vertex group with Dynamic Paint, and we want to give it to the cloth. But at the minute, the cloth is going to happen before the Dynamic Paint has created our vertex group. So very simply, all we need to do is move our Dynamic Paint up, and I'm going to put it right at the top, and I'm just going to move this box a bit lower down. And you can see the Dynamic Paint updating there. So what I'm also going to do is actually go back and set a maximum stiffness value. At the minute, there'll be still no stiffness because we haven't set it up. So we want the maximum stiffness, which will be defined by this weight, to be 15. And I'm also going to copy those settings for the bending stiffness. So this will also be 15. And if we make sure we're at the beginning, I'm just going to press Alt A. And you can see everything's got a bit slower because it's going to calculate a lot more. But you can see that the bottom is no longer collapsing. So we can see that the weight paint is stopping some of the text from collapsing. But the point is we do want it to collapse at some point. So what we need to do is then erase the weights that we've just added. And unfortunately, just by animating the box and moving it downwards away from the text, that wouldn't make the weights go away once they're painted. When we're using mesh, volume and proximity, once it's painted, it is on there for good. So we need a separate brush to then erase it. So that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to go into front view, press Shift D and just press Z. So we're moving this box upwards, and I'm going to go back to the beginning. So it's above the text, but this time, and you can see it's already painting on top because it's copied the settings. This time we don't actually want it to paint, we actually want it to erase the paint. And what we're going to do is animate this box coming down. So I'm going to press I, location, and then I'm going to move to about frame 45, and that's when it should have moved down and erased all of the weights. So press I and location. So one thing I'm going to do is select our bottom box, select our top animated box and press Ctrl P and choose Object, Keep Transform. And so this box will now copy the movement of this top box, so that when this moves down, this will also move down out of the way and won't be painting on the mesh anymore. And then what I'm also going to do is add a few extra cloth properties. Now that we're getting somewhere, we can start to fine tune it a bit. So I'm going to change our mass to be 0.15, so it's a bit of a lighter material. And I'm going to change the structure to 1, so it's far less stiff. I'm going to change the bending to 0.05, and I'm going to put the springiness down to 0. And then instead of just pressing Alt A, because we've got a bit more going on now, I'm actually going to press Bake All Dynamics, because we want to bake both the dynamic paint and the cloth at the same time. So what I want to do is clear out the current cache, so I want to free all the bakes, and then Bake All Dynamics. And you can see it's going a lot slower now, and that's because it's doing both the dynamic paint and the cloth. If it goes quickly, it means it's probably remembering the frames it's already got for the cloth, and it's not recalculating them. So sometimes what I found I had to do to completely get rid of the old cloth simulation was to save the file, close it and reopen it again, and that would definitely get rid of the old one. So if at any point I have to do that, I am actually going to cut that out of the video, because there's no point you watching me do that. But if it goes slowly, it's probably doing it correctly. If it goes too quickly, it's probably only calculating the dynamic paint. So if I run that through, we can see the text collapses, the bottom stays solid, and then it all collapses, which is exactly what we want. However, there is one slight problem still, and that's the fact that this valve, which is where the cable connects to, also collapses completely, which it really shouldn't do, because if it's meant to be connecting to something, it's probably going to be a bit more solid than the rest of the object. So that's what we're going to deal with next. And to do that, I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I want to select all the vertices, all the faces that make up this valve. So I'm just Shift Alt clicking to select. And once I've done that, I'm going to go over to the Data tab, and we've got our vertex group there that the cloth simulation is using, and I'm going to add a new one, and I'm going to call this Valve Mask. And I'm going to make sure the slider's at 1, and I'm going to click the sign. And if we go into weight paint mode, we can see that we have solidly assigned just the valve. And so what we need to do is find a way of combining this vertex group that is for the cloth with this valve mask, so that this valve stays stiff throughout the simulation. And to do that, I'm going to add a modifier. You may not have used it before. It's called Vertex Weight Mix. And I'm going to move this above the cloth simulation again and above the subsurf. I'm just going to minimize a few of these. And you can see we've got a lot of options here, but what this basically does is allow us to mix two different vertex groups together. So what I'm going to do is in vertex group A, I'm going to choose our DP weight, and in vertex group B, I'm going to choose our mask. And a lot of these options we don't actually have to worry about. all we need to worry about is the mix mode. And that actually explains a bit better what the modifier does. So if I hover over it, we can read the tooltip that says how weights from group B affect the weights in group A. We want our mask to affect our main vertex group. And we're going to change the mode to add. And so what I'm then going to do is rebake. So free all bakes, and then bake all dynamics. So now that's finished again, if we run through, we can see our valve is staying much more solid. Even though it's pointing down, which isn't ideal, it is staying solid so the cable still can look like it's connected. So now that we've roughly got our cloth simulation done, we can actually begin the process of reversing it. So if we start from the end of the animation, and something I'm actually going to do is add another subsurf just so we can see how smooth it is. So we've got one before it, set to level 1, because we don't want it too high, otherwise it will slow down the cloth simulation. And then we've got one after it just to smooth it out again. If we start to play this back, we can get an impression of what it would be like when it was inflating. Now obviously you can spend a lot more time fine-tuning it, because you can see this middle bit is a bit squashed, so maybe we should have repositioned these boxes of where the weights are going to be. Maybe this central bit should have been a bit stiffer for a while longer. But in general, we can see the inflating effect. So what I'm going to do is find the flattest part of the cloth simulation that I want to be the start of our reversal. So we obviously don't need too much of this because it's pretty similar. So maybe frame 140, that can be at the beginning of our text inflating. So I'm going to press Shift-D, and we've duplicated our object, and obviously it's lost all that cloth simulation data. So I'm going to press H to hide it, and what I'm going to do is apply our subsurf modifier. Remember, it's only level 1. I'm then going to apply our cloth, and I'll be explaining a bit later on why we had to apply the subsurf, but the reason why we had to apply the cloth is that it freezes the simulation in position. So now this is a static mesh. So then we can remove the other modifiers, and we don't need the dynamic paint anymore because that was only there for the cloth, and we have applied the cloth. And then I will then move this to layer 2. So still on layer 1, I'll press Alt-H to bring back our mesh that has all the cloth simulations not applied to it. And what we're going to do is now choose the next position that we think is significant and we want to freeze. So what we're basically doing is creating several different meshes of different stages of the cloth simulation, and we'll then combine them together later on. But what you notice is that when we duplicate it, it can no longer read the cache, so we do have to recalculate it. But what we can do is reduce this 250 to 140, because we've already frozen the mesh at frame 140, so we know we don't have to bake anything after that. So I've set both the dynamic paint and the cloth to 140. I'll then free all bakes, and then bake all dynamics again. So now I've baked again, but you will notice instead of the solid lines we were getting before when I baked, we are getting a few what I would call errors, because I haven't seen this sort of thing before, but we're still roughly getting what we want, in that it's simulated up to frame 140. So now what we want to do is find the next significant kind of pose that the cloth is making. So a lot of these frames, there's not a significant amount of movement. So this frame looks like it could be a good one. So we'll duplicate and hide, and then we'll apply the subsurf modifier, the cloth modifier, we'll remove the other modifiers, and we'll remove the dynamic paint. And then we will move that to layer 2. We'll Alt-H to bring back our original, and we will then repeat the process. So our end cache time can be 120 and 120. so that's for dynamic paint and for the cloth, and then we can rebake up to frame 120. So the good thing about this is that although we're having to do multiple bakes, each bake is going to be quicker than the last because it's having to do less frames. And so what I can do now is continue backwards through the timeline and repeat the process for every kind of significant shape that I find. So now we've actually done all of the significant steps. So if I bring back our original once more, we can actually get rid of all of this, and by get rid of I just mean move to another layer, just in case we ever want to go back and change it. So I've selected everything, then pressing M and then 0, we can move it onto our last layer. And now on layer 2, what we can see here looks a bit of a mess, but it's actually every stage of our simulation. So I'm going to select everything and move it back to layer 1. And now what I'm going to do is select all of these, Shift E, and move these onto layer 9. So what we're basically doing is backing up each stage of our project, so that should we want to go back to one of the stages, we haven't got to start right from the beginning. So now we've got these shapes, we can select them all, and then I'm going to select our top shape last, because that's our final shape. And then over in the Data tab, we've got our shape keys, and it's shape keys that we're going to be using to combine these meshes into one. If you haven't used shape keys before, it's a way of saving the position of the vertices of a mesh, and you can have multiple positions and then animate between them. So it's often used for character animation, for lip syncs, when you want to have different positions for the mouth to be in. You might have a different shape key for each sound that the character could make. Now we're not exactly using that, but we're going to use shape keys in the same way, in that we're saving the position of the mesh at different stages of the simulation. So I'm just going to go in this little drop down arrow here, and we see we've got the option join as shapes. So if we do that, a whole list appears, and so what we can actually do is select this last mesh, the one that has the shape keys, invert the selection with Ctrl I, and then delete the rest of these shapes, because they're actually already stored within this one. Now that may sound a bit complex if you haven't worked with shape keys before. Basically each stage of our simulation had the same number of vertices, and so Blender can remember the position. So when we merge all the different shapes we had, Blender's going to look at, say, vertice number 15, and it's going to say, well, in shape 1 you're in this position, but in shape 2 you're in this position, and it can remember for the individual vertices the positions. So now, although these aren't named very well at the minute, we can actually increase this property here, and you can see we're actually going to different points in our simulation. And this is the reason why we applied our subsurf modifier, because our cloth simulation actually used the subsurf modifier, because the subsurf was before it in the modifier stack, and it needed those extra faces. So the subsurf created all the extra faces, and the cloth sim then used it. So if we were to calculate a cloth simulation with a subsurf, but then remove a subsurf, the cloth simulation is going to be looking for a lot of faces that don't exist. And that's why we had to apply the subsurf, because we needed those faces to exist. So now what we need to do is make sure these are in the correct order. And by that I mean we want to go from, say, the top of the list being inflated and the bottom of the list being deflated. So our basis is going to be inflated. And then we want to go down the list and make sure they're roughly in the right order. So that looks like it's correct. So I'll name that as just 1. That looks like it could be the next one. So we'll press 2. And hopefully these will all be in the correct order. So we'll try it and press 3. So we've got all of our shapes going from inflated all the way down to deflated. And I also want to create a few more shapes, and we're going to create these ones manually. So the first one I'm going to do is a flattened version. So we've got deflated, but after it's inflated, then become overinflated, and then it whizzes off round, and it should become completely flat when all the air has gone out of it. So I'm going to put this up to 1, and you can see it's applied our shape key, and I'm going to do a new shape from mix. And what that's done is basically created a duplicate of it. But what we can do is go into edit mode and now edit the shape. So this one we are going to make a bit flatter, but we don't want to lose all of the detail that the cloth simulation has given us. So we are going to be a bit careful about what we do. And what I'm going to do is turn on proportional editing. So I'm just going to enable it. And what that does is mean that even though I've got one vertex selected, I can move a whole group. And if I shrink this circle, the area of influence increases or decreases. And so I'm just going to try and make this mesh a bit flatter. And I'm just going to press G and then Z and just move down part of our mesh. And I'll just turn on the subsurface so we can see what we're doing. And then I can just select a vertex and press S and Z and start to flatten it out. Now we don't want to go too over the top, but we do want to just roughly flatten it down, and it won't matter too much because we're not actually going to see this up close. So there we have a rather flattened shape, and you could of course spend a lot of time making this a lot better, but for the minute that will do. And so I'm going to rename this flattened. And I'm also going to create an overinflated shape. So I'm going to select our inflated one and just click the plus icon. So you can see it's basically empty at the minute. I'm going to make sure everything is selected and press Alt S to begin a shrink flatten tool. So I'm just going to scale it up to about there, press enter. And tabbing out of edit mode, it looks like it's disappeared. But if we increase our slider, we can see that it's there. I'm going to call that overinflated. And now what I want to do is move these into a better order. So obviously it's after it's inflated that it becomes overinflated. So I'm just going to move this up, and then I'm going to do the same to flattened. So it becomes deflated, goes up to inflated, it overinflates, and then it flattens out again. If we were at this point to change one of our sliders, we would notice that it's not really working, and in fact it's doing some strange stuff. And that's because these shape keys are looking for a base shape key, and the base shape key is the top one. Now you remember when we first combined them, the base shape key would have been this one. It was at the top, and so all these shape keys are expecting this one to be at the top. They are saying, according to this shape key, how far have my vertices moved? But because we've changed which is the base shape key, it's now this top one, they're moving their vertices incorrectly. Now that doesn't actually matter, because if we tab into edit mode, we can see they're all still there, and so everything's alright. Now apart from it looking weird, there's also the issue of how do we animate in between all of these shape keys? I mean, we've got the order, But how do we animate that? And you could animate each of these sliders, but there's actually an inbuilt way to do this. So I'm just going to uncheck this relative check mark, and suddenly we've got some new options. And we've got something here called evaluation time. And if I were to increase that, and if I just zoom out, and I'm going to hold shift so it fine-tunes this value, we can see we can scroll through our shape keys and they play in order. So we only have to animate this evaluation time and Blender will do the rest. So what I'm going to do is try and find the maximum value. This value works a bit weirdly in that it's a bit hard to tell where we have to animate it to. So I'm just going to go to a point where we don't see any change. So it looks like it could be frame 90. If I go beyond that, there's no change. So 90 is going to be our starting position. So I'm just going to press I with my cursor over to place a keyframe. I'm then going to move forward 20 frames. And it should be that if I go down 10 units, we should get to the next shape key. I'm going to put in another keyframe. But I'm actually, instead of doing -10, I'm going to do a -12. So this will become 78. And I'll put in the keyframe. And then I'm going to go forward 15 frames. And then put it back up to 80. So we're going 90, 78, 80. And what this will do once we get a bit further along is it will give that slight deflating look. So I imagined that when the pump was working, it was almost slightly inefficient, you know, as if the valve was slightly weak and was letting some air out each time. So it would inflate and then deflate a bit, inflate and then deflate a bit. And so I'm going to repeat this pattern of keyframes. So going 20 frames and -12, 15 frames +2, all along until we get to 0. And so at this stage it should be, actually looks like it might be 12.5. So for some reason it does get a bit strange at the end in that the numbers don't seem to quite match what we did at the beginning. So you just do it by eye by the time you get to the end. Right, so now we have got almost right down to the end. I haven't done the flattened one yet because we're going to be doing that one slightly differently. So if we scroll through, we can see our text gradually increases. So overinflates, and then we'll do the deflating after that. And we don't yet know at what point it has to become flat because we haven't animated this object around the curve yet. So we will do that last one a bit later. But we will add the curve now. So I'm going to go into top view. And the curve, by the way, is the way that we're getting this object to zoom off into the distance before landing on the ground. I'm going to do Shift S cursor selected, so the cursor has gone to the center of the text, and then I'm going to do Shift A and add a curve Bezier, and we can't see it because it's inside the text, so I'm just going to change it to X-ray, and in edit mode I'm then going to move these points so that the curve starts at the object origin and draw a rough outline of where I want the object to go. And so now I'm just going to give a bit of height to some of these points. So I'm just going to move a few of them upwards. And obviously you'd want to spend a bit of time fine-tuning this because I'm doing this pretty quickly. But what we roughly want is for the balloon to kind of peak and then dip down. So I'll make that a bit sharper. And so what we need to do now is attach the text to the curve. And because I want it to deform around the curve, rather than just follow the path of the curve, we're not going to use a follow path constraint, we're actually going to use a curve modifier. So I'm going to remember the name of this Bezier curve, and then back onto our text, curve modifier, Bezier curve. And so what we can do is actually animate the position of the text, and it will offset itself around this curve. So because we're deforming along the x, if I move this object along the x-axis, so G and X, you can see it moves around the curve, and it's also curving around it. It's not just following it, it is curving. So I'm just going to undo that and move it back to where it was. And so we're going to get to the point where it's just overinflated and it's just ready to shoot off. So I'm going to insert a keyframe for location, move along to maybe frame 280, and then just on the x-axis, even though it's moving off this way, I'm still just moving it on the x-axis, and we'll move it to about here. And then I'll insert a location keyframe. So currently it inflates and then shoots off. Now we can see we're having a few problems, and that is to do with a property on the curve called tilt. So I'm just going to select these points and press Ctrl T, and we can tilt or rotate the curve. So it's now sitting upright. And you can see it's getting a bit squashed here, so maybe I have made the curve a bit too tight. So I'll just try and soften this out. And we're not actually going to notice this because it is going to be flat at this point, but we can fine tune it a bit. And so we can see here again, Ctrl T to alter the tilt. And that will probably do. So now that we have the movement, we know that we can animate our final shape key. And that is going to be our flattened one. So we've already got a keyframe here for our second to last shape key, which is the overinflated shape. And so we can go right to the end now and just reduce this to 0, insert our keyframe, and it's now at the flattened stage. And again, we can alter the tilt just so it is lying a bit more flat. And I'm just going to move it along the curve a bit more. So I'm still going to move it on the x-axis, and even though it looks like we need to move it to the left, we're actually still going to continue moving it on its local axis, which means it still has to move to the right. So I'm going to press G and X and just move it along till it's at the flattened point of the curve, and then just replace that keyframe that was there. So now if we scroll through, we can see it inflates, overinflates, and then shoots off, and then as the air is supposedly coming out of it, it flattens out. And obviously I'm not actually going to show the fine tuning of this animation, but you would want to spend a bit of time getting the acceleration right as it goes around the curve. There was something else I did to give this a bit of variety, because you'll notice that even though this is going to be going pretty quick and we're not really going to see a huge amount of it, it does look a bit flat, but it doesn't really make sense that it would completely flatten out. So we're going to add a bit of randomness to it by adding another modifier. I'll just minimize these, and we're going to add the wave modifier. So if I just turn off the curve for a minute, and we can see the wave modifier gives it a wave. And to see what the effect of the wave modifier might do, we can just move this offset value, and we can see it is waving, but it's currently coming from the middle. So I'm just going to change this X location to about 8, and what I've done is moved the center of the wave from here to about here. We can see that the waves are now starting at a different place. It doesn't really matter if it's at either end, we just don't want it in the middle. So I'm going to set that back to 0, and I'm going to turn the curve back on. Obviously we don't want the effect on it when it's just sitting still, so we're going to find the point that we start to animate away, which is here, keyframe 260. And then what I'm going to do is keyframe these values to be 0. So we don't want any effect to begin with. And I'm just pressing I over them to insert keyframes. And we're also going to animate this time offset. Then we're going to move forward a few frames to the point where kind of the wave can come into effect. And I'm going to set the speed to be 0.02, the width to 1.5, the height to 0.5, and the narrow to 1.5. And then I'm also going to change this offset value to be minus 230. And this value is a bit weird, but it basically allows the waves to play forward and backwards. So this number is a bit random and you can play around with that. The more you increase or decrease this number, the more the waves will move during the animation. If we only set this to something like -5, you'd get very slow waves going through. And actually what I'm going to do is, at this frame, this is going to be 0, and it's at the end that this is going to be minus 230. So I'll insert a keyframe there. And I'm also going to move it above the curve, and now you can see it's come into effect. And I'm not really sure why it has to be above the curve, but I guess it's something to do with its location being deformed, so it needs to have the pre-deformed mesh. So we can see this is what it looks like, and we're just giving it a bit of variation as it moves around. And then at about this frame, we're going to insert another keyframe for them all, and then move forward a few frames and set them back down to 0. So again, we've turned it off just by setting these to 0 and inserting keyframes again. So that's actually most of the animation done, or as far as I'm going to take it. And we can actually focus on some of the materials now. So I'm going to bring back a layer I already have on layer 5. And all this is a curved background, which is basically just an extruded plane upwards with a subsurf modifier. And then I have a few lights, and they just have emission set to 5. And they are going to act as our light source. And this just has very basic diffuse material. And obviously we are working in the Cycles rendering engine, so we are going to be using nodes a bit later on. And so what I'm going to do is split my view over so we can have this as the rendered view. And I'm going to change this to the node editor. So I'm going to click new material, and I'm going to change to rendered view. First thing I'm going to do is add a shader, mix shader, and I'm going to mix between a diffuse and a transparent. And we can't really see the effect at the minute, so I'm just going to set up some world settings quickly. So again, new world, and I'm going to use an HDR image just to give a bit more variety to the lighting and to add something for the reflections to reflect. So Shift A, texture, environment texture, and I'm going to choose an HDR image I've got. So I'm going to link that up, and it's got way too bright, so I'm going to reduce the strength to 0.2. I'm going to Shift A and add a color, RGB curves. And I'm not actually going to do anything to this, but what this basically does, I think, is compress the HDR data back down to normal RGB data. And it basically keeps all the lighting, but it reduces all the noise we're getting. So if you're not doing a completely photorealistic render, you can actually get away with just compressing these colors back down. And then one final node, a color, hue and saturation node, and reduce the saturation to 0. So I don't want any color coming from that HDR image. And if I go back to our materials now, making sure we have our text selected, it can be a bit hard to see sometimes, so do make sure you're editing the right material. And then I'm going to reduce the mix factor of this transparency to about 0.35. And then I'm going to change our diffuse to a red with a bit of purple and pink in there. And you can start to see some of that transparency down at the edges here where we've got overlapping edges. It becomes a bit darker. So the next thing I want to do is add some highlights to our text, because we're not picking up any highlights from the lighting, and that's because we're using just a plain old diffuse material. So I'm going to duplicate our mix shader, and I'm going to add in a glossy shader. And I'm not going to change anything apart from making it a bit brighter. Then I'm going to plug that in. You can see we're picking up the highlights now, and just for the way I want it to look, that is a bit too bright for me. So I'm going to reduce that to 0.1. And something I want to do now is actually add something which isn't so realistic, but I did like the effect it gave, and that's to kind of add a bit of fake lighting to our object. And to do that, I'm going to again duplicate our mix shader with Shift D. I'm also going to duplicate our diffuse, and I'm going to change it to something that's quite contrasting to the original colour. So I'm going to change it to a blue, and that's just so initially we can see very clearly what effect we're going to get from this. So I'm going to plug this into the mix shader, and obviously blue and red makes purple, but the mix factor we're going to use is actually going to come from another node. So I'm going to Shift A, Input, and we're going to use Layer Weight. And that gives us the ability to change the colour depending on what part of the mesh is facing us. So I'm going to set it so that the front parts of the mesh are going to be red, and the parts that aren't facing us, so the sides, are going to be blue. So I'm just going to plug in facing, and we can immediately see that effect. Obviously that's a bit too intense, so I can change this blend factor to reduce the sharpness of that. So I'm going to reduce it to 0.15. It becomes a lot softer. And obviously I don't actually want to use this blue, I just wanted to do it so I could clearly see how these values would affect the material. What I actually want to do is copy this red again. So I'm going to Control C over the colour field, and then Control V, and that pastes it in. And then I'm going to reduce the saturation of this colour to be a lot lighter. And what you can see is that it's giving it a slight highlight around the edges, and it's just a way of giving it kind of some fake lighting. The problem at the minute, and the reason why these edges are standing out a bit more than I'd like them to, is because our front faces are using a mixture of diffuse and glossy. Our side faces are just using diffuse. So to correct that, we will again duplicate a mix shader, and we'll move this along a bit. And we can reuse this glossy shader for the side material. So now both the sides and the front are slightly glossy, and again I am going to reduce this just to 0.1 so it's a bit less intense. And then I'm actually going to move back in the timeline, and we can see what I think is quite a nice effect. Obviously one thing I have to do is move the ground up, because it's not quite matching at the minute. And you can see here we're getting some of the mesh coming through, and again you could go into edit mode and select the shape key and move some of those edges to be above the ground, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. So let's have a look at it again now that I've adjusted the floor. And you can see we're getting quite a nice effect. And to me, it looks quite like a balloon, it looks a bit rubbery. One extra thing we can do is actually add in some depth of field. So that's actually the material done. So I'm going to collapse this node panel down, go into solid view, and the reason why I want to add some depth of field is just to emphasize that the object has moved far back in space. It hasn't just got smaller, it has moved back. So I'm going to select our camera and turn on the limits, and this basically displays a line which is the focus line, and this little yellow cross here is the point that's going to be in focus. So we can adjust this by changing the distance value under depth of field on the camera properties. So I want our text to be in focus, so that's where I've moved this yellow cross to. We can now hide that, and if we move to a point where the mesh is in the background, and if I increase this to maybe 0.05, change to rendered view, we can see this is actually getting blurred because it's out of focus. But if we move back to the beginning, we can see our text is in focus. The next thing I'm going to do is set up a few render layers, and that's so we can actually have some vector blur on our mesh as it whizzes by. So the first render layer I'm going to set up is going to be our text, and that's going to be layer 1, and it's going to have a mask layer of layer 5. And that's because I said about how sometimes parts of the mesh might go through the plane. We're not getting it here, but if they did go through, then they wouldn't be receiving the lighting that we've got above the plane, and so they would appear very dark in the render. So just masking them out says, if anything does happen to pop through underneath the plane, just hide it from view. What I'm also going to do is open up the passes and enable the vector pass, which is the one that we're doing this for. I'm then going to add our background render layer, and that's going to be layer 5, and we don't actually need to change any properties for that. One last thing we need to do before we render is just make sure that under film we're rendering with a transparent background, and that means we can very easily recombine it later because the text will have a transparent background, so we can recomposite our background onto it. So we've got our render layer set up, we've set it to transparent. I'm going to change it to 50%, and I'm going to put the samples maybe up to 200 for the render, just for a quick render, and then we'll have a look at the result of the render. So we can see that the render is finished, and indeed we have got a transparent background, which means we can put our rendered background back in later. So we're going to do that now, and go into the node editor again. We're going to change to compositing though. I want to use nodes and enable the backdrop, but to see the backdrop we need a viewer node, so I'm going to Control Shift and click, and that creates a viewer, and then I'm going to shift and drag a line through these to join them into one, because they're always going to have the same shared input. So I'm going to duplicate our render layer, but select the background this time, and then color alpha over, and we'll just swap them around, and we can see we've combined our layers again. And then we can do our vector blur, so filter vector blur. And the reason why we separated out the background rather than just doing the vector blur on the whole render is that the camera isn't moving, so the background isn't going to blur at all. So it'll be a bit of a waste of time having the vector blur, have to calculate the blur for the whole of the image when it's really only the text that needs to blur. So this should speed up a render if you're doing a whole animation. So I'm going to plug in the Z and the speed. And I did make the mistake of rendering a frame that wasn't actually moving, so I'm just going to quickly re-render when it's moving off. So if I go back into the node editor now I've re-rendered, you can see we're getting our vector blur, and I'm going to turn on curved. That tends to improve the quality a bit. I'm going to increase the samples to maybe 64, so we get less of that banding, and I'm actually going to reduce the blur because it may be a bit too much, to 0.75. And so that's how we do the vector blur. I'm going to show you one final thing, and that is how to connect the cable to the text and then have it disconnect when the text shoots off. So the first thing we need for this, and I'm just going to go back to layer 1 for this, is to have another curve. So I'm going to Shift A and add another bezier. I'm going to quite quickly just create a cable and move it roughly into position. So we can imagine the cable's going in and joining the mesh there. I'm then going to go into the curve properties and give it a bit of depth and resolution. Make sure it's full, so it is doing a full circle. And what we can do is go into edit mode on the curve, select just this handle by clicking on it. I'm going to press Ctrl H to bring up the hook menu. And what I want to do is hook to a new object. And you can see that an empty has appeared. So if we go into object mode, we select the empty, we've effectively parented this curve handle to this object. And what we can then do is parent this empty to a part of this mesh. So I've got the empty selected, and I'm going to shift select the text. I'm going to tab into edit mode and select the shape key over inflated. And what I want to do is select 3 vertices that I'm going to parent this empty to. So I've parented the 3 in roughly a triangle, so it'll be parented to roughly the center, and then I'm going to press Ctrl P and make vertex parent. So if I tab into object mode, we can see how empty is shifted a bit, so I am just going to reposition it. If we move through the animation now, we can see that our empty is completely following our valve. Now obviously at some points the valve points directly down, and so the curve would be going through the floor. We can add in a few extra points to reduce that. So if I select both our points and press W subdivide, we've added another control point. And so you can see the effect is a bit reduced. Now you can fix that further by then manually, animating this at the beginning and have it following for the majority of the animation. So from here, so you could just put a few keyframes in for location to fix this. But the main thing I want to focus on is how to separate it, because obviously it's shooting off and I wanted the cable to disconnect. At the minute it's just stretching. So I'm going to find the point where it shoots off, which is here. And at this frame, if we click on the curve, we can actually see that hook we added. So when we press Ctrl H and it added this empty, it also automatically added this constraint. So if I uncheck that, that's turning off the hook. So what we can do is animate this force value. So I'm going to press I over it, advance to the next frame and turn it off. And so what we've now done is disconnected this cable. The new problem is that the cable is now just suspended in midair and we still need to be able to move it. So this is where we go in and add our second hook. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, and like we did before, selecting that control point, Ctrl H, hook to new object, and we've now got our second hook appearing. So I'm going to tab into object mode, and I'm going to insert a keyframe straight away. So I want this to be on when this one is off, because it's taking over from this empty here. I'm going to go back a frame and turn it off and insert a keyframe. So now the text is shot off, and we can now insert a keyframe for the location of this hook, move forward a few frames maybe, and then bring this handle down and add another keyframe. So we've got one hook doing the parenting, overinflates, it disconnects, and the cable falls down. So that's basically the whole effect done. And obviously there are many things that you can fine tune as part of this effect, and that starts from right from the beginning, from adding the dynamic paint, fine tuning how much you want the mesh to be initially stiff and how quickly you want it to collapse. You can then fine tune which shape keys you're going to choose, so which positions of cloth simulation you think are significant and you want to add. I only added 7 or 8 positions. You can obviously add a whole load of shape keys if you want it to be super accurate to the original cloth simulation. You can then also fine tune the shape keys themselves. You can go into edit mode, and if you want to change their shape, you can just edit them as you see fit. And then obviously when you get onto the actual animation, you can fine tune all of the speeds, and I didn't really spend a lot of time fine tuning things like the acceleration around this curve or the animation of these empties. I did it very roughly. You can obviously spend a lot more time than I did making it look the way you want. But the main point of this tutorial is to give you an overview of how this effect can be created and how to reverse a cloth simulation so you can get some interesting effects. So I hope you've found this tutorial useful. I hope you learned something from it. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.